Welcome to A Catholic Overview of the Bible, a video program 2, which goes after Lesson 10. The families of the patriarchs were well acquainted with Egypt. It was the most powerful country of the Near East during the second millennium before Christ. The surrounding lands were more often than not under its control. Besides, the Egyptian influence, strong in Canaan, famines also drove both Abraham and Jacob's family into Egypt for food. The pyramids, which were already 500 to 600 years old when Abraham came to Egypt, must have been famous landmarks for them as they are now for us. Here is an artist's depiction of the brothers of Joseph coming to Egypt looking for food. We know the story of Joseph. God meant for good what Joseph's brothers had intended for evil. So according to God's plan, Joseph had succeeded reaching a seat second only to the Pharaoh. The sons of Jacob, or Israel as God had renamed him, came to Egypt then, seeking food for their families. Where the previous slide was an artist's depiction, this comes from a tomb in Egypt, showing Semitic-type peoples, so different from the seated high-ranking Egyptian, coming to beg for Egyptian grain. Here, too, from an Egyptian tomb, men and women are depicted like skeletons from famine. This Egyptian relief depicts a not uncommon plight of peoples dependent on the food they themselves could raise. A series of disastrous dry spells could bring their stores to nothing. Again, the Egyptian bas-reliefs from the old ancient tombs back up what Genesis says Joseph's work was in establishing a system to save the area from 7 years of famine. In the center of the picture are bins with workers carrying and pouring in grain above, and workers carrying off the allotments below. The collections from farmers into state-owned granaries were a common practice and recorded in these tomb figures, showing slaves bringing in the produce and scribes in an adjoining room like the IRS keeping the records. Israel's sons were given land in Goshen to farm and to graze their animals. The Egyptians considered animal tending an unclean occupation, so they were allowed to live apart, but gradually, as the centuries went by, they were pressed into servitude and then into slavery. Here in modern Egypt, farming can be in the old ways, as an oxen with a blinder turns the water wheel for irrigation. The country was ruled by pharaohs who, because they were considered gods, had unquestioned authority. They were both assisted and at times controlled by a powerful system of priests. Remains of great temples testify to the dominating force of religion over the land. Here, a temple built just after Moses left Egypt is approached through an avenue of rams. One of the great wonders of the world is the ancient temple of Amon, Incarnate. Over the centuries, to extol their god status, the various pharaohs added to Karnak a series of great temples, the oldest of which may date back even to prehistoric times. This particularly well-known temple, even appearing in an Agatha Christie movie, was certainly a center of religious ceremonies when the patriarchs visited Egypt. In his prominent position, Joseph no doubt knew it well. It is at Thebes in Upper Egypt, which we would call Lower Egypt, because it lies along the Nile in the south. The Sphinx guarding the Great Pyramids that is so well known is not the only one. These were royal portraits of pharaohs given the body of a lion to symbolize the mighty strength and protective power of Egypt's god-ruler. Pharaoh Tutankhamun's golden treasures, found in what is called King Tut's tomb, went on tour in America in the 1970s, astounding all who were fortunate enough to see them. King Tutankhamun reigned in the 1300s BC, about 150 years after Joseph's rule in Egypt, and 250 years before the deliverance of the Israelites under Moses. He was relatively unimportant, and his small tomb was overlooked and not discovered until 1922. Protective figures of the Egyptian gods surround King Tutankhamun's gorgeous outer coffin. The young king still lies in his beautiful stone sarcophagus in the burial chamber of his tomb. However, the magnificent treasures from the tomb were placed in the Cairo Museum, which sent them on the world tour. Mrs. Dorothy Eady, an American who believed in reincarnation and immigrated to Egypt in the mid-1900s, lived at the temple at Abydos and believed herself to be Sethi I's mother, calling herself Sethi. Sethi I was the king whose daughter rescued Moses from the Nile and whose son Ramses II would thwart Moses until, with the death of the firstborn, he finally relented. Abu Simbel is the site of the temple of Ramses II, which was barely saved from the flood which inevitably accompanied the construction of the Aswan Dam. When the world was alerted that this great historic site would be destroyed, crews had only a brief window of time to move this and other temples to high ground. The cranes had their work cut out for them, for at Abu Simbel, Ramses also built a tomb and a temple to Nefertari, his favorite wife. Then he added more gigantic statues of himself, typical of the ego that defied Almighty God. Exodus tells us that God used his hardness of heart to display God's majesty to the world as he poured down the plagues to free his people. This is the mummy of Sethi I, Ramses II's father and the adoptive grandfather of Moses. The mummy of Ramses II lies in the Cairo Museum. He lived into his 90s and reigned 60 years. X-rays of his teeth reveal abscesses, cavities, receding gums, and exposed roots. He must have had gigantic toothaches. Traces of cocaine have been found in some mummies, stimulating speculation that there was trade with the only place where the cocoa plant grew, South America, even in those ancient times. This would cast a whole new view on the discovery of the Americas. This is another view of Ramses' mummified head. You are looking on the face of the man whom Moses confronted. The giant carved figures at Abu Simbel were portraits of this face. One of the colossal heads of Ramses awaits reassembly at the site of Abu Simbel after the original site was flooded by the dam. The great project of moving his statues to the crest of the hill, along with the temples from the site, was successful. Another huge chunk of a Ramses statue is pictured on its way to the London Museum in 1816. Early archaeologists thought nothing of carting off Egypt's treasures to the museums of the world. Skulls of the uncounted mummified sacred cows, used originally as offerings to the gods, come to the surface of the desert. Imhotep, a genius physician-healer, became more than famous. After his death, he was elevated as the god of medicine. Over 1 million ibis, the great crane of the Nile, were mummified as sacred to Imhotep, and were given as votive offerings for cure-seekers. They lie to this day in subterranean chambers beneath the desert. Though Ramses II adored his favorite wife, Nefertari, having his name and hers carved together in many places, in a scale of values, he adored himself much more. Ramses' giant fist from one of his monolithic statues. His fist was clenched against God and his servant Moses. Business in Egypt, the buying and selling of cattle, are modeled in figures found in a tomb. The scene is similar to transactions carried on in Joseph's day as he prepared the country for 7 years of famine. This is a continuation of the previous slide. In company with the gods and goddesses, Nefertari was laid in this tomb. The beetle-headed god Serket protects the dead. Isis, Osiris's wife. Horus, the falcon, son of Isis and Osiris, is the sun god. Rephra, the early morning sun goddess, is to the left. At the back is Osiris, the great creator god Atum, and to the right, Hathor, goddess of love. Substantiating the accounts in Genesis, tomb paintings give us invaluable information about Egyptian life. Here, brickmakers, including Hebrew slaves and overseers, are shown making bricks. Different races are painted different degrees of color. The clay is gathered on the upper left, kneaded with water by foot, pressed into molds, and the finished product carried away in the lower right. The process was painted on a tomb in Thebes in about 1450 B.C., just 100 years or so before God used Moses to free his people, the Hebrews. This building brick from the Exodus period is actually stamped with the royal seed of Ramses II. The straw that was used as a binder is visible. Here, an artist depicts the making of bricks of delta clay moistened with water, which is brought to the site in jugs, trampled into proper consistency, straw, then added for strength, then pressed into wooden molds. When partly dried, it is removed to finish hardening in the sun. As the great Pharaoh Ramses glorified himself, the Hebrews continued to labor, crying out to God for relief. Then, when their labors only intensified, they cried out against Moses. The Pharaoh Ramses is depicted in his chariot leading his armies. No record was kept by the Egyptians, strangely, because they loved detailed records of their exploits, but no record was kept of the disaster to their chariots and charioteers, who had attempted to recapture the people of God that God was defending. Akhenaton's family are depicting worshipping the sun god Disk. Akhenaton was a king who ruled Egypt between the times of Joseph and Moses, and who attempted to change religious practice to the worship of one God, to monotheism, which makes us wonder if the Hebrew religion had influenced him, though his idea of one God was nothing like God's revelation of himself to the Hebrews. He moved the capital from Thebes to Akhenaton, or Tel Armana, to escape the domination of the powerful Egyptian priests, whose power came from the populace's worship of many gods. Even his mother conspired against him, and soon after his death all returned to the worship of many gods. Even the art forms seemed to change under Akhenaton, looking more like exaggerated modern art. Here he worships the one god Aton, the sun, of whom he considered himself the Incarnation. This painting, called Israel in Egypt, was painted by Edward Poynter, depicting the drama lying behind the Exodus story when Israel was slaves in Egypt. Before the people left Egypt, Jacob, or Israel, died, and on his deathbed Joseph brought his two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, for his father's blessing. And as in many cases in the Old Testament, God favored the younger over the older, and Jacob crossed his hands. Joseph tried to correct him, but Jacob insisted on blessing the younger, and then a secondary blessing to the older. Along the seacoast of the Mediterranean on the Sinai, this place is called Pharaoh's Bath by the Bedouin in the area. Their legend says this is the place of Israel's escape. A sulfurous odor is believed caused by the bodies of the drowned Egyptians. Beginning its trek in the March-April Hebrew month of Nisan, here in the northwest Sinai is the wilderness of Shur, and this is where that journey began. The rainfall here is less than 4 inches a year, and in summer the temperatures are 100 degrees and more. The people immediately began to complain to Moses. A Sinai oasis where travelers may find relief from the desert sun and water to replenish their supplies. We read in Exodus 15 and 16 how the Elam Oasis was a haven for Israel. There are a number of Baptist churches named Elam Baptist, as I recall. The Wadi Garandel Oasis is where Israel found 12 springs of welcome water. Off again across the southern Sinai desert trekked the people of God, led by Moses into the land of Midian, where Moses had first gone to live as a fugitive from Egyptian justice. This was the place of the burning bush, perhaps something like those in the foreground. It was here that God first revealed his powerful name, Yahweh. In the background is the far-off mountain range, which includes Mount Sinai. Camels are the mode of transportation on the Sinai even today, though Israel had no camels for its journey. The first battle was fought with the wild Amalekite tribe near this place. Joshua, a very young man, had his first victory over enemies at Rephidim. The outcome of the battle was dependent on Moses holding up his hands to God on a high hill. God cursed the Amalekites, who became chronic enemies of Israel. The Sinai Desert again, with the mountains in the background, just as Israelites might have seen Mount Sinai for the first time. It isn't difficult to imagine the Israelites camping at a place like this for the year that they resided here on the desert in front of the mountain. From the Mount Sinai top, we look off over the rough mountain range. In such a setting, with thunder, lightning, and cloud, God revealed himself to Moses. You may be able to discern in the bright light there at the top of that mountain a small chapel. It tops the mountain at 7,500 feet, where God appeared and spoke with Moses, and where the 10 Commandments were given. A recent news report suggests that Mount Sinai will be made into a tourist attraction. It's hard to know how to feel about that. The Quran also identifies with Mount Sinai, or also called Mount Horeb, as sacred to the Muslims. Saint Helena in the 4th century had a chapel and a tower built at the foot to commemorate the burning bush. In 527, or someplace around that date, Justinian built a fortress monastery for monks at 5,400 feet. Built at the request of Greek hermit monks and dedicated to St. Mary, it is still lived in by Greek monks, although many of the surrounding refuges that were occupied by hermits are now deserted. In the 10th century, it was dedicated to St. Catherine. Another view of St. Catherine's monastery. In this monastery, a very ancient and valuable manuscript of the Bible was found. It's called the Sinaiticus Codex, written in biblical, I believe the word is uncial, or capital letters. It's on the lower left. It was found in St. Catherine's in 1844 and is now in the British Museum, written in the 4th century, with corrections later made by scribes in the 4th, 5th, and 7th century. It has exercised a vital influence upon all subsequent studies and versions of the New Testament text. These rocky formations are on a site where copper was once mined in the Sinai in biblical times. Perhaps it was from these Egyptian mines in the Sinai that the Israelites got some of the necessary materials for building the ark and the tabernacle and their sacred vessels. Long before the Israelites trekked across this land, in Sinai a people lived. Moses and the people crossing this desert could have marveled at these prehistoric burial chambers that are still to be seen. With this picture of the tabernacle taken from an 1890 Bible dictionary, we recall the outcome of God's revelation of himself to Moses on Mount Sinai and the holy covenant that was pledged there. Moses commanded the people to build a tabernacle according to the design he had received from God. Here the people would worship God in the way he told them and obey all his commandments. Then they would be his people and he would be their God. The next slide program will take up the story from here. For this Catholic Overview of the Bible video program 2, we are making these picture acknowledgments. From Google Images, Reader's Digest, Great People of the Bible, Time Magazine, Life Magazine, The Bible as History and Pictures, The Illustrated Bible Dictionary, Scribner's Dictionary of the Bible, Rogerson's Atlas of the Bible, Biblical Archaeology Review, and Robert Cross.